In that moment, as the key twisted and the scream reverberated through stone and memory, Alaric felt a shift inside his very existence, not just within his body but within his past. The scream wasn't only coming from behind the door. It was echoing through time, inside him. Like something he had once loved and lost was crying out, not to be forgotten. There was recognition in the voice, but more than that. There was accusation. Like he had broken something sacred, or betrayed something ancient. Madeline clutched the wall as the ground began to tremble again. This time not from machinery or magic, but from emotion, as if the building itself remembered pain. The symbols etched into the stone now bled golden light, not fire, memory light. Alaric saw flashes, a hand reaching for his in a burning field, pages written in his own blood, a child in a white mask saying, "You promised we wouldn't be forgotten." And in all of them, he was older, wiser, and terrified, because something was coming through the door now. Not a creature, not a person, but a moment that never should have existed. Like, subscribe, and stay with us till the end. The door didn't swing open like a passage. It peeled, like layers of time being unwrapped. With every inch it opened, Alaric saw not space but memory, woven into architecture, a cathedral made of moments he had never lived. The hallway beyond was lined with mirrors, but they didn't reflect. They played scenes. In one, he was standing at a pulpit, preaching to people whose eyes glowed white. In another, he was running through a snow-covered forest, holding the same manuscript now clutched in his hands, only soaked in blood. Another showed him locked in a circular room, clawing at walls covered in the same spiral symbol. Madeline didn't follow immediately. She touched the doorframe, trembling. "Are you absolutely sure this is the jet path?" "No," he said, "but I think I already walked it. I'm just walking it again." They stepped into the corridor. As the door sealed behind them, the sounds of the outside world fell away. No wind, no echo, just a low thrum like breathing, but not theirs. The air inside smelled of wet parchment and candle wax, like an old library that had never been opened. The mirrors lining the walls began to flicker as they walked, each showing a different possibility. Some showed Alaric dying, stabbed, drowned, burned. Others showed him alone in a chamber made entirely of clocks, but none showed Madeline. She noticed. "Why aren't they showing me?" Alaric didn't answer. He didn't know how to say what he felt, that perhaps Madeline wasn't supposed to be here this time, that maybe she had already walked her timeline and stayed behind. As they turned a corner, the corridor abruptly ended in a spiral staircase descending straight down, carved in obsidian, rimmed with gold symbols that shimmered when his hand brushed them. The deeper they went, the more gravity twisted, like space was folding around their descent. At the bottom of the stairwell was a single iron door, this time with no symbol, just a phrase scratched violently into the surface in the same Latin, "Memoria est clavis." Memory is the key. Alaric reached for the latch, and from the other side, something knocked. 3 times, and then whispered, "You finally remember?" The whisper lingered in the stale air like dust made of words, ancient, tired, and too heavy to vanish. Alaric froze. There was no mistaking it this time. The voice was his own. Not distorted, not aged, just hollow, like it had been drained of everything except memory. He looked at Madeline, hoping she'd deny what he just heard, but she was already a few steps back, eyes wide, hand pressed against her chest as if trying to keep something from crawling out. "You heard that?" he whispered. She nodded slowly. "It knew your name before we arrived." The door before them wasn't as grand as the others. It looked like something torn from the back of an old monastery. Iron rusted, edges cracked, hinges fused with time. But it wasn't locked. The latch moved under his hand as though it had been waiting for centuries just to feel his touch again. And behind it, the silence wasn't empty. It was listening. He opened it. There was no blast of air, no cinematic rush, just a stillness so dense it pressed into their lungs. The room beyond wasn't a chamber. It was a replica, a perfect reconstruction of the study from his dreams. The broken grandfather clock, the tall bookshelf filled with forbidden tomes, the cracked window with the violet-red sky outside. He stepped in, heart pounding, trying to reconcile the impossible. "How?" he started to say, but Madeline interrupted. "This isn't a replica," she said, voice suddenly cold. "This is the original, your original." Alaric turned to her confused. "What are you talking about?" Madeline stepped forward, brushing her fingers across the dusty desk. "This place was erased. It existed in the fringe, a memory caught in the outskirts of recorded time. No one was supposed to find it again, but you wrote your way back." He looked at the desk, and there it was, the third manuscript. This one bound in dark leather, its cover pulsing faintly with a red glow beneath the surface, as if something alive was trapped within. The spiral symbol was gone, replaced by something else, a sigil made of two mirrored faces, eyes stitched shut, foreheads touching. "I never wrote that," he said. Madeline's hand trembled. "You didn't. Not as you are now." Before he could respond, the clock chimed. Once. And in that sound, time shifted again. Alaric fell to his knees, his mind pierced by a wave of forgotten days. He saw himself as a boy, standing on a hill under 3 moons. He saw his mother, or something that had taken her form, whispering that he would rewrite endings that were never meant to begin. He saw a cult in black robes bowing before a stone altar, chanting in a language that no longer existed, and heard a phrase echo across all the scenes. "You are not their savior. You are their memory." The chime faded. The study was silent once more. But now, the walls began to breathe. Not metaphorically. They were breathing. Alaric staggered backward, watching in stunned silence as the walls inhaled and exhaled, like a living lung made of stone and memory. The wallpaper, once old and faded, now rippled like flesh, pulsing with each breath. The chandelier above gave off a dim, blood-warm glow, as if drawing power from the room's awareness. Madeline didn't speak. She couldn't. Her eyes locked onto the bookshelf where the volumes had rearranged themselves, their spines spelling a sentence he couldn't read at first glance, because the letters were shifting. But he could feel what they said. "You are inside your own forgetting." "What is this place really?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Madeline's answer was almost a whisper. "It's not a place. It's a consequence." Alaric stepped to the desk again. The third manuscript was humming now, but not with energy, with grief. A slow, resonating sorrow that bled from its binding. He reached for it, but the instant his fingers brushed the cover, a cold shock stabbed into his spine. His vision blurred. The room disappeared. Suddenly he stood alone in a candle-lit corridor made of stone, walls lined with portraits of himself, each one older, more tired, more twisted. Some versions had eyes missing. One had no mouth, another wore the cult's spiral mask, but it was fused to his face. He walked slowly, each step echoing like a judge's gavel. As he passed each portrait, they whispered, "You chose to forget. You let her die. You broke the circle. You are not the first." He reached the end of the corridor, where a mirror waited. Not a portrait, a reflection. And in it stood a version of himself, but ancient. His skin etched with symbols, eyes like burnt gold, voice low and broken. "Memory is not what you remember," it said. "It is what refuses to let you go." Alaric gasped and pulled back. He was back in the room, but something had changed. Madeline was no longer looking at him. She was kneeling before the manuscript, tears streaming down her face, whispering something he couldn't hear. Her hands were pressed against the leather like she was begging it, or confessing to it. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping toward her. She didn't look up. "It's not just your memory, Alaric. It's ours. We did this together, and the room wants us to remember." Before he could ask what she meant, the chandelier above sparked violently, and every candle in the room extinguished at once. Darkness, total, absolute, consuming. Then, from the far corner of the room, a match was struck, and in its brief glow, a third figure stood watching them both. He was holding a spiral mask, dripping with fresh blood. The figure didn't move. He simply stood there, lit only by the flicker of the match, which never seemed to burn down. The spiral mask in his hand oozed something darker than blood. It dripped thick, like ink infused with memory, pooling at his feet and soaking into the wooden floorboards. Alaric couldn't breathe, not out of fear, but recognition. He wasn't just seeing someone new. He was seeing someone he had tried to forget. Madeline rose to her feet slowly, her voice trembling. "It's him. The one you left behind. The version of you that never made it out." "No," Alaric whispered, shaking his head. "That's impossible. I burned everything. I destroyed this chapter." "You didn't destroy it," Madeline said, voice rising. "You sealed it away, inside yourself. He's not a memory. He's the cost." The figure finally stepped forward. The matchlight didn't travel with him. Instead, the shadows moved around him like they were protecting him, or perhaps listening to him. The mask in his hand pulsed once, and then fused itself to his face, wrapping around like a living thing. And when he spoke, it was in Alaric's voice, but older, raw, and laced with bitter truth. "You thought you could bury me beneath belief. But belief is a door, Alaric, and you left it open." He raised his hand, and the room reacted, not with destruction, but with remembrance. The walls displayed flash memories like projections. Alaric performing ancient rites in a forgotten cathedral, writing with trembling hands as black-robed figures watched in silence, placing the mask on a child's face, and whispering, "Only one of us gets to leave." Madeline turned to him, tears flowing freely now. "Tell me it wasn't true. Tell me you didn't choose this, that you didn't choose yourself." Alaric's throat went dry. I don't remember doing any of this." "That's the worst part," said the masked version of him. "You do. You just don't want to." Then, without warning, the mask cracked. Not physically, but symbolically. A sound like 1,000 whispers crumbling at once echoed through the study, and suddenly all three of them were standing inside a cathedral, its roof gone, sky bleeding violet light. Candles floated in the air, flickering with scenes from multiple timelines, some where Alaric was a priest, others where he was a prisoner, and one where Madeline wasn't Madeline at all, but something far older, wearing her skin. He turned to her, a terrible thought rising in his chest. "Who are you really?" Her silence was the loudest answer of all, and in that silence the cathedral began to collapse, not physically but historically. Pillars of forgotten time fractured, raining down moments that had never been lived. And in the chaos, the spiral on the floor glowed bright red, pulling them toward a final memory none of them had ever dared to witness. Until now. The spiral beneath them pulsed again, this time like a heartbeat, ancient and wrong. It wasn't a symbol anymore, it was an organ of the cathedral, alive, pumping through dimensions that had never fully healed. The floor beneath Alaric vibrated as memories erupted around them like spectral eruptions, screaming faces, chanting voices, blood-soaked rituals in collapsing churches, all frozen in fragments, looping endlessly. Alaric clutched his head. "I can't hold it all. These aren't just my memories." "They're ours," Madeline whispered, her voice breaking. "Fragments of who we were, and what we let happen." The masked figure stepped forward, now glowing with a red-tinted aura, his voice overlapping with dozens of other Alarics, some crying, some chanting, some begging. "We erased others to save ourselves. We were told the prophecy needed a vessel. We agreed to become the wound." "No," Alaric said, staggering back. "We never agreed to this." "You did," the figure replied. "And then you begged to forget. But forgetting is not forgiveness." The cathedral's windows shattered outward, not from explosion, but from grief, an unbearable cosmic sorrow. Through the broken arches, Alaric saw what lay outside, a sea of versions of himself, walking in spirals, their eyes sewn shut, some praying, some screaming, all trapped in loops of past decisions. Every one of them had taken a different path, and all had ended here. Madeline turned to Alaric slowly. "I'm not who you think I am." His voice cracked. "I know." She touched his shoulder. "I tried to help you forget because I didn't want you to hate me when you remembered, but the prophecy, it didn't come from the cult. It came from me." Alaric stared at her, shattered. "Why?" "Because you weren't supposed to live, and I wasn't supposed to care." The words sliced through him deeper than any blade. In that moment, the spiral erupted into blinding red light, and all three were pulled downward, not falling but folding, collapsing inward like thoughts being erased mid-formation. Time, identity, purpose, all disassembled. And at the center of that collapsing self, Alaric saw it, a single chair in a silent void. A child sitting, writing in a language not taught but remembered. A voice whispering into the child's ear, not from above, but from within. "Write it again. But this time, forget who you are." The child looked up. It was Alaric, and behind him, Madeline, watching, not crying, but smiling. He understood nothing, and yet somehow, he understood everything. If this happened to someone close to you, what would you believe? Comment below. Alaric awoke on a cold marble floor, gasping, wet with sweat, but there was no cathedral, no spiral, just silence, and a flickering overhead light that buzzed like an old radio losing signal. The air was heavy, as if it hadn't moved in centuries. Around him, tall filing cabinets stretched infinitely in all directions, labeled not with numbers or names, but with feelings. Remorse, catalogued. Love, unreturned. Betrayal, mutual inherited. Faith, broken, misused, weaponized. This was no dream. This was a repository of choices, not his alone, but everyone's. He tried to stand, but a sharp weight pulled at his chest. He looked down. A thin, rusted key hung from a chain around his neck. The same key from the manuscript room. Only now, its shape was warping with every breath he took, like it was responding to thought instead of locks. Then, somewhere behind him, the sound of bare feet running, light, hurried, a child. He turned just in time to see a blur disappear into one of the corridors. "Wait!" He chased the sound, boots echoing off the marble, until he reached a narrow aisle labeled simply, Unwritten Futures. There, standing before an empty cabinet, was the child again, back turned, silent, writing something into the air with a glowing finger. Each stroke left a trail of symbols that burned into Alaric's vision and into the skin of his arms. His veins lit up like lines on an ancient map. The boy finally turned. It was him, younger, unsullied, the version before the cult, before the prophecy, before Madeline. The child spoke without lips moving. "You gave me away. You chose the mask, but I never stopped writing." The burning symbols formed a new spiral on the floor, and this time, Alaric wasn't pulled in. He stepped in willingly. Suddenly he stood in a candlelit chamber, circular, infinite, walls lined with mirrors. But every mirror showed a different Alaric, each mid-sentence reading from different versions of the prophecy. Some whispered, some screamed. One bled from the mouth, one had no eyes. The masked version of himself reappeared in the reflection, but didn't speak. Instead, he simply lifted his hand and pointed behind Alaric. He turned. Madeline stood at the center of the room, arms raised, floating slightly off the ground, her eyes glowing with white fire. Her voice echoed in 3 layers, child, woman, and something older than time. The prophecy was never about salvation. It was always about containment. You were not chosen to save the world. You were chosen to hold what should never be spoken, and you let it remember itself. The mirrors cracked. The reflections began to bleed out of their glass prisons, merging, forming a spiral, not of time, but of versions of him. He screamed, but the sound came out in his child voice. And somewhere deep in the spiral, a bell rang. Once, then again, and again. The bell's final toll echoed with the gravitational weight. It didn't just resonate through the air, it dragged. Each note tore at the fabric of the spiral, collapsing centuries into seconds, memories into dust. Alaric dropped to his knees as the reflections of himself, hundreds of versions across fractured time, began circling him like predators. Some limped, others cried, a few just stared, silent and accusing. A voice rose from the mirrors, one he hadn't heard since childhood. The bell tolls for those who refused the burden, and still took the reward. The spiral began compressing, not in motion but in meaning. Symbols once cryptic now made sense to him, not because he learned them, but because he had written them. Long ago, in a body that bled ink, not blood, in a monastery that existed outside history, in a moment where time was still being decided. One of the mirrors shattered, not glass but memory. Out of it stepped a version of himself, cloaked in red, blindfolded, speaking only in phrases from the manuscript. He who fears time has already surrendered his name. Truth is a wound disguised as salvation. Only the vessel remains. If it forgets it was ever whole. Alaric tried to run, but the spiral now had gravity, pulling at his bones, dragging him toward its center. The masked version of him waited there, seated in a throne of broken clocks. Timepieces ticked out of sync, dripping sand and ink both. Madeline knelt beside the throne, her head bowed, whispering something he couldn't hear, until he realized she wasn't whispering to the masked Alaric. She was whispering to the spiral itself. We brought him back. We brought him full. The masked Alaric rose. There's only one thing left to do. From beneath the throne he pulled the final page, yellowed, frayed, and sealed with the wax crest of the forgotten cult. A spiral wrapped in thorns. He offered it to Alaric, who stepped forward like a man walking into his own funeral. Read it, said the masked self. I can't. You already did. Alaric's hand trembled as he broke the seal. The symbols ignited instantly, not in fire but in recognition. His mouth began to move, repeating words he had never been taught, but somehow had always known. As he read, the mirrors screamed. The versions of him burned away one by one, not in pain, but in release. Madeline looked up, her voice a whisper of guilt. You were never meant to carry this. But once you did, we could never let you stop. The spiral contracted completely, and time didn't collapse. It chose. One version, one fate, one memory that would survive the reset. Alaric read the final line, and so the one who remembered was erased. Everything went silent. Everything went white. And in that whiteness, something ancient finally slept again. The whiteness lingered, not as light, but as absence. It wasn't blinding, it was blotted. A silence so deep it felt like pressure, not peace. Alaric floated somewhere beyond time, bodiless, nameless, not dead, not alive, but forgotten, exactly as the prophecy had demanded. He couldn't remember who he was, where he had been, or why his soul ached like something precious had been ripped from it. Then, a crack. Small, delicate, like the first fracture in ice. A voice filtered through the nothingness, distant at first. Familiar. You'll come back differently. They always do. He turned or tried to, and shapes began to melt into form. A hallway, fluorescent lights, faint hum of electricity. A hospital. Alaric's eyes snapped open, gasping. He sat upright in a narrow hospital bed. Moch. Ines beeped around him. A nurse shrieked and ran for help. His mouth was dry, his throat burned, his body felt aged and hollow, like it had been borrowed or returned from a long, unpaid loan. A doctor entered with a stunned look. "Mr. Carradine, you've been in a coma for 7 months. Do you know your name?" He nodded slowly. "Alaric Carradine," then paused. "I think." They flooded him with questions, memory tests, photographs, dates. He passed some, failed others. He remembered fragments, a manuscript, a cathedral, a spiral. But every time he tried to trace those memories, they dissolved like fog under sunlight. He knew something had been surgically removed from his mind. That night, alone in his room, he noticed the window was open. A woman stood just beyond the glass. No hospital gown, no security badge, just a long dark coat, and eyes that glowed faintly silver in the moonlight. "Madeline," he whispered. She nodded once, then slipped something through the gap in the window, a thin, rusted key on a chain. His hands shook as he took it. "Why?" Her voice was barely audible. "Because you erased the memory, but not the consequences. Because the spiral was never about prophecy. It was a prison, and now it's waking up again." He looked down at the key. It was changing, bending, twisting, not to fit a lock, but to fit his hand. Alaric sat alone in the dim hospital room, the key cradled in his palm like a living thing. He couldn't remember what it opened, or why it filled him with such quiet dread, but his hand refused to let go. There was no logical reason to trust the feeling, yet it pulsed through his fingertips like an ancient instinct, one that predated memory itself. That night, after the last nurse completed her rounds, Alaric disconnected the monitors. Machines wailed, but he moved quickly. No one stopped him. In fact, no one even seemed to see him as he walked barefoot through the emergency stairwell and into the cool night air. It was like he was already fading from their world. Madeline emerged from behind the altar. Her eyes were no longer glowing. They were red from tears. She held a small wooden box in her hands, sealed with the same spiral thorn crest from the prophecy's final page. "You sealed it once," she said, "but the world doesn't forget what it fears. Now it remembers." Alaric stepped forward. "So what do I do?" The masked version reached up and pulled the last piece of his mask away. His face was identical to Alaric's. "You already know." Madeline set the box at his feet. From inside came scratching, a whisper, and then a voice, his own, pleading, "Don't open it." But his hands were already moving. Alaric's fingers hovered above the latch of the box, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The voice inside, his own, was begging now, shifting between fear, sorrow, and something else. Understanding, but understanding too late. The spiral didn't speak in words. It didn't threaten or promise. It invited. And once that invitation was accepted, it never closed again. Madeline turned her face away, tears tracing silent lines down her cheeks. The masked Alaric, now barefaced, hollow-eyed, stepped back into the shadows, fading like dust in reverse. Time didn't move forward here. It circled, over and over, until someone broke the loop, or became it. The latch clicked. The box creaked open. Inside was nothing at first, just velvet lining and darkness so pure it seemed to pull light inward, but then it shimmered, and the spiral appeared, not as an object, but as an idea that shaped itself around his thoughts, coiling through his memories, rearranging his fears. It wasn't meant to be contained, it was meant to be hosted. His body stiffened, not in terror, but in recognition. The final memory returned, not of what the prophecy said, but what it required. The one who completes the spiral must become its silence. Alaric tried to scream as the spiral entered him, but no sound emerged. His shadow warped, his bones twisted in place, not breaking but realigning, bending into geometries that didn't belong in nature. Eyes opened across his skin, briefly, then vanished. For a moment his mouth glowed with silver symbols, the language of the first scribe, before his entire body stilled. He stood there, silent, still, changed. Madeline approached cautiously. "Alaric?" He turned to her, and though his face looked the same, something beneath the surface had coiled. "He's not here anymore," he whispered, voice layered with echoes. "But I remember him. I remember all of them." She backed away. Outside, the city clocks began to tick backward, faintly at first, then in synchrony. Time had chosen its new vessel. The spiral was no longer sealed. It was walking, and it remembered everything humanity forgot. If this series moved you, hit like, subscribe to Mystery Cults, and share it with someone who loves the unexplained.